Uh, Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to the Informal Talks webinar series. My name is Vidisha. I am a fifth year urban design student from SEPT. And first of all, we hope that everybody is safe and sound. It's just been a week since our semester has begun online. And today we bring you our first monsoon semester talk for the Informal Talks webinar series. So I will be your moderator, and before I request Mehenas to introduce Dr.Navdeep, Mathur to everyone, if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to write them into the chat box to your right. And after the presentation is over, we will have about 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer session. So please feel free to ask questions and let's have a discussion. So over to you, Mehenas.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Welcome here. Happy the new semester, online semester, which is very different for all of us. Also, kudos to all of you to decide to go ahead and do this semester, and I hope you'll all be very successful during it. Navdeep, thank you very much for accepting our invite, and then also for your extreme flexibility always, and accommodating us in your busy schedule. Thanks. I think many of you would not know Navdeep. Navdeep is a faculty at the Indian Institute of Management here in Ahmedabad. And his education has been in global political economy. His Ph.D. is in public policy and administration from Rutgers University in US. He basically conducts research on urbanism, resistance, and alternative processes to the top-down approach in planning of the cities. He teaches courses on social justice, politics, public policy, and interpretive methods in IIM and other universities. He has attended from the very beginning the studios in BUD from the initiation of the program. He has been a part of the studios and different kinds of conversations and courses that has been going on. And he's offered his critical views on the processes that are involved in the planning and design of public spaces, which are not from a design point of nature, but from economic and policy nature. And he has talked to students about inclusion of all of the stakeholders, regardless of how formally their stake is recognized. We've had conversations. Navdeep has guided also students from SEPT in their research about the alternative processes and possibilities of an amalgamation between a top-down and bottom-up approach. Yeah, I think he's always been very flexible, very accommodating, and very supportive to us at SEPT. Whenever we have called him, he's been there. Navdeep, thank you very much. And please, over to you.
Thank you so much for this warm introduction, and also to an invitation to this talk. I know very little about sort of the kind of area of urban design, but for a very long time I've studied power in the process of urban planning. So when I was studying public policy years ago, my specialization was in urban planning from a political science perspective, and among several authors, the one that I think is really worth reading, among many others, is James Scott on state making. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So the way in which I look, and the title of this talk is called Untitled, Planning is Dispossession. it's a rip on many things. You know, to title or titling is a way of providing property or property rights, and you know, untitled, you know, apart from the fact that a lot of people use it on pieces of I guess art or or other objects that they would like people to reflect on, to have their own views on, rather than trying to provide labels, something like this. But of course, there's a contradictory subtitle, planning as dispossession. In the studies that I have engaged in and with other urban planners, critical urban planners as well, we've come to sort of understand how state power acts through the discipline of urban planning and the gaze of the state in making disorder or disorderly populations visible, legible, and controllable as what urban planning is geared towards. So that's why this title. Let me just put the presentation on and show some images and a short video. And I'm not going to say too much about these things, but I hope that people are familiar with the Sunday Bazaar, Gujari Bazaar, and this idea of planning as dispossession is to look at what happened on the Sabarmati. In case I don't know if there has been some literature also by a colleague at SEPT. Renu Desai and Sejal Patel, colleagues who've written about the dispossession, the processes of displacement, of violence, of severe loss of rights and livelihoods on the Sabarmati during the Sabarmati project. So you know, this is part of that sort of critical view on large urban transformation projects, which is this, you know, which is the Sabarmati project. Now it's writ large in other ways in the rest of the country. If you can see the screen. The interest in the Sunday Bazaar, the Gujari Bazaar, which was on the riverbank of the Sabarmati prior to this Sabarmati Riverfront project being built, was done through a field trip for a course at IIM called Socio-Cultural Environment of Business. Usually business is thought of as, you know, large industrial houses and things like this, but at least in IIM, mostly business is considered the large business corporation. There is some focus on smaller businesses, but there is certainly almost no focus on the vast part of the economy that is considered informal, that is self-organized. Rather than calling it informal, I would prefer to call it self-organized, because it runs the livelihoods of more people than do corporate large businesses. We engaged in field visits. This is more than 10 years ago, 2007, 8, 9. Lots of visits for a course, and then sort of spending time on Sundays at the bazaar, shopping mainly. But as a consequence of spending several hours every Sunday for several months with students and friends and conversations with so many people who were in the bazaar, what we did get to know were about people's fears of being displaced. Newspaper images that showed that the bazaar would no longer be there, but there would be a very colorful, not colorful, but a sort of a very upmarket tent-like, you know, structure, a European American tent-like structure, which has these air-conditioned sort of shopping spaces. As a consequence of these conversations and sort of the expressions of fears of displacement and the legal notices to evict the bazaar, many of us students, faculty of IIM, SEPT, NID got together and started having conversations with the association. The association was a association that that ran the bazaar for the last 600 years. It was always an association run market, and it has interesting dimensions in terms of the religious backgrounds. It's a space of religious synthesis. It's a place where the bazaar was a place where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, others, people from Dalits, and a lot of independent women entrepreneurs were actually the sort of foundation of this bazaar. They had during the 6 or 5 major riots in Gujarat, the bazaar was the one place that was a safe haven. It's a kind of an island of peace, along with other neighborhoods on the riverfront. So it had this interesting history that one sort of engaged in reading, understanding, and also then the architectural design plans on the Sabarmati, that while in some ways showed some kind of a zoning for markets, it was really not clear uh, uh, whether there would be a bazaar of this kind, whether the same traders and the same association would have space in the new riverfront project, because of the legal eviction notices that they had gotten from Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation. So along with these students who developed these concerns and all of these different folks, over a couple of years, a film was made, a documentary film called Global Sites, Local Lives. It was put online, and it was made in Hindi, Gujarati, and English, and widely distributed to mobilize people's thoughts, opinions, conversations, concerns about the Sunday market and its displacement, and the importance of the Sunday Bazaar in Ahmedabad. So we realize it's not just the 12 to 16 or 2,000 traders that come there, but they support an ecosystem of several lakhs of people who are engaged in different parts of the processes. And as a small snapshot of the work that was done by several collaborator students, I'd show you a short animation that attempts to document one of these things. And the idea eventually was that since it's a democratic association and a democratic space, what is the possibility of collaborating to intervene in avoiding the displacement of the bazaar, providing an alternative that fits in with the Sabarmati Riverfront project plans, not to disrupt necessarily the riverfront plans, but to see what kind of a space can be made for this bazaar, for this association. So we have, I've put some names up here if you can see them. Sana was a student in NID. Vineet and Tanishka were her teachers, who were all very interested in this idea of collaboration, of collaborative design, of social design. And along with the several groups of people who came every Sunday, they started visiting the bazaar. And if you can see in this slide, there's an image, small image on the left. I don't know how clear it is, but we have Sana standing there with a bunch of students, as well as people from the bazaar. So traders would walk in, and there was this cardboard model which represented what the bazaar was like at the time, and how the construction of this riverfront project was actually transforming that space and taking that space away. And this part of this cardboard modeling and this sort of this effort of visualization, sort of ground level visualization of people wanted a new bazaar if they had space in that place in the new project, would be through collaboration. And this is what they came up with. I'll show you images what it looked like, but this was all done through constant engagement, conversation, and visualization through these models that I'm sure all of you commonly use in sort of designing space, three-dimensional models made of cardboard or plastic or wood or whatever. So these were basic things, and a lot of the field work was done every sort of Sunday in the bazaar. And this was the documentation. If you can see what the documentation, it was a very slow process, but one that was very engaged in how people lived, and not just on looking at, okay, how many traders are there, what do they earn, and this is the value of the bazaar. So so that's the most dehumanized way of thinking about a living ecosystem. To our effort was, and given that none of us really had, many of us didn't really have these skills, so spending time thinking about how people lived, what was the lived experience in the bazaar, all of the different people, what did they represent in terms of history, geography of Ahmedabad, the lives of people, the migrants who came, all sorts of things were part of the documentation, just to understand what would happen because of the eviction of this bazaar. What would be lost? What would be demolished? What would die? What would be what would be erased from Ahmedabad, from the city, from the river, from all of these spaces? It's not just a matter of a few vendors, as it's quite often casually represented. Here's the story. So many of these efforts were to document the life histories of people. This is Zubeda Ben, and she makes carts, and she sells carts on the riverfront. She's been doing it for about 35 years, 40 years. She's a designer and entrepreneur. I'll show you a short film which says something about her. In case you don't see a video, please let me know. Yeah. Sorry, what was that? Can you see it?
Yes, Navdeep, clearly.
Super. So this is the documentation, another sort of a map that was made of someone else, another trader at the Gujari Bazaar, Ganibai. So this is another way in which this was documented, and a short animation was also made. So, and lived experience was mapped, looking at family, looking at skills, previous work, uh, uh, you know, where people lived, what did they do on other days, all the places that they visited. So trying to build an entire ecosystem of their lived experience. The idea was that in most common newspaper articles at the time, and even common conversations with you know, in the circles of academia, etc., the way in which traders were referred to or vendors were referred to are sort of in this very dehumanized way of numbers. You know, there are like 20 traders who remove from a street outside IIM, 20 traders lose their livelihoods, but they earn very little, like, you know, it was said like 100 rupees a day. So that's not really much. Not that they're actually representative of skills, lots of other people, entire ecosystems that, you know, are the foundation of this economy. So in order to sort of see this in a very broad way, in order to humanize, well, not just people, but the way in which the economy is organized, not just in terms of graphs and numbers that one can zoom out of in terms of these sectors. So this mobilization that had all these methods also had this website that was there. I think it's I don't think it functions anymore. Um, and what the idea was that whatever information about the bazaar was being put out by the municipal corporation and the architectural firm doing the riverfront was actually extremely harmful to the people. It was diminishing them. It was devaluing them. It was really calling it, you know, the architect called them crooks who don't pay taxes. The municipal corporation said that they're a nuisance. They're dirtying the river. So this entire way of life, and the fact that, you know, lakhs of people would turn up on a Sunday, and for many of them, this is the only place where they could buy modern goods. There was not just goods of these trades, but many other things that are available if anybody goes to the market. So the idea was to transform the way in which that market was understood. Except for a few people in Ahmedabad, the newer, more modern generations had simply lost touch, and, you know, were completely bought in with these versions of that everything around the river is a waste, and it's a great idea to get rid of it and do this project. And the idea of this design disruption was to actually transform that, but also to do something productive and have a collaborative process. Part of that was to document its history. You can see this map, which maps the movement of the bazaar from 1414, 1941, 54, all these different locations, stretches, etc., and the main places where it was clustered and concentrated. And that it was not just a bazaar of traders, that its transformation and movement also suggested it as a political space of democracy building, formation of collectives and of consensus. Um, this is some images of when the riverfront project was being built, the concrete walls were being laid, and how it was sort of crushed together on the left, how it was sort of disrupted. The bazaar was being disrupted by this process, and as a consequence, a lot of economic and social value was lost in the meantime. On the right is this image. It's an older image of the bazaar when it functioned without hindrance. This images like these were shown that it's not a messy and a disorderly and thing, that people have their own ways of producing functional order, just visual order from the eyes of modern urban designers and those that privilege a certain kind of Western aesthetic is not order. And there may be other ways of ordering and organizing things that work for how the economy actually functions. This is a picture of the market being absolutely disrupted by these by the construction project, by the walls, and by moved in the land. This is the it's an image of when, after a long struggle and a court case, a public interest litigation that was lodged for the bazaar to have the right to stay as part of the project, that some effort was made. Although this wasn't the effort that the bazaar officials and traders had undergone with the NID and folks. But in any case, this is what it was like. So when it sort of, after having won the right to operate, it was after several months of disruptions, some traders started coming back and operating. And over time, while they did sort of form back, but there were the kind of spaces they had, the lack of democratic negotiation ability, everything was marked and cleared and ordered according to this design of 6 feet by 12 feet or whatever it was, but not something as in the market that they had earlier, that they would democratically get together and redesign spaces as and when people needed to. This is an image of the design that had been made with the NID team and the traders themselves, where they would remain closer to the river, and it would be using all of this foliage, because one of the main things in Ahmedabad, it's very hot and it's very sunny, and people need covers. And the current bazaar and the way it was designed, when HCP or EPC designed the bazaar, there was no thinking of any kind of cover, right? It was a bazaar that was to be just slabs, just these concrete slabs. So I'm going to stop this here, and maybe take questions, and if there's other stuff that we can talk about, we can take it from there. The final thing is that this idea of collaboration is and bottom-up planning, etc. All of this stuff is interesting when you have, and it can be taught or worked on when you have an enabling state, a state that is authoritarian, basically, that privileges the gaze of an elite aesthetic on everything. Most of these things don't really work. Much of it would fail because state power is exercised through the use of violence. When the bazaar was being removed, when it was being evicted, there were and other neighborhoods were being evicted. There were like 200 police trucks, and walking around there was like a bit of a horror. So it doesn't matter what people had filed in the courts; everything was wiped clean, and it was a violent, bloody process. If that's the kind of a state that we have, then some of these collaborative projects are, it's really good to talk about them. It's really good to learn. It's really good to, but in better times is something that when they would work out. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation, sir. I think this was super insightful, considering that we have these frequent discussions in our studios pertaining to democracy, exclusion, infrastructure, and we're always trying to figure out our role as urban designers in trying to bridge this gap, between the powerful people and the people who are excluded, in such projects. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure I'm looking forward to a great discussion here. I think we'll probably wait for a minute or so until the questions come up, because they usually, they come up after a minute. People take time to type.
Sure.
Meanwhile, while we're waiting for the questions to come, Navdeep, I wanted to ask you if you can give, if there has been a good case to you, a case that one can refer to where the stakeholders have been, incorporated in a more democratic process, and where the decisions have affected the design, the planning.
So, I mean, there are these sporadic examples of, see, the idea of stakeholder involvement can also be highly manipulated, right? You get a bunch of people from a local community that can be co-opted into sort of, into something that, see, there's a reason why urban transformation projects happen, right? They create value. And in our time, they create capitalist value for real estate industry, right? Revenues by the state. Anything else is a tax. Anything else seems like a loss. So unless it enables that kind of stuff, then there's no point of having the stakeholder involvement. There was something called the BSUP a long time back, Basic Services for the Urban Poor, part of the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission. And that had a mandate of public participation and stakeholder involvement. Several cities got to it with different results and different efforts. I think Indore is what I've heard has done a really good job of participatory movement. I think Sejal Patel would know a lot more about this. But one that I know about was in Nanded, the municipality of Nanded and Waghala in Maharashtra, where there was a city commissioner, an IAS officer, who was very sort of honest and transparent about participatory processes. He was also sensitive. He organized these workshops, neighborhood workshops, over a span of 2 years to understand the ecology of how people live in these settlements. People who don't have property titles, who don't have the rights to where they live, they've over time settled. In so-called legal planning terms, they are called encroachers. But he found that a terrible sort of a usage, and he stopped using this word altogether, right? He said that I'd rather see these real estate developers who sort of start construction and then they pay off people as encroachers, rather than people who are fending for themselves on a daily basis. So he organized these workshops and allocated funds to these community groups, many of whom themselves built the housing that they had designed for different purposes. Several people had animals, so they built designs of neighborhood clusters where animals would be kept. So they built these community spaces instead of this idea that, okay, we have 2,500 people to be displaced from here. Let's build 27 buildings. Each building will have just doing sort of simple dehumanized math. They actually went to the effort because it was about themselves, and they were given some sort of power over the resources. And this person, his name is Nipun Vinayak. He's, I think, a senior civil servant at this point, but this was more than 10 years ago during the BSUP. So if there were people who were keen, I mean, in Ahmedabad, the antipathy towards poor people by the administration has been tremendous. Because, it's like this, from the top, we have orders to clear this neighborhood so we can build something fancy, so we can put it in the papers, so we can say the Ahmedabad model is really cool. We can sell it to investors. That's all that was cared about. The rest of it was just lip service. But in several places, it has happened. There have been projects which have official sanction. which have been created officially. Informal stuff can keep going on. We can keep going and doing a project in a neighborhood, in a community, and keep, doing the stuff. If it changes that space, which has, isn't seen positively by the state authorities, it's anybody's guess if it's going to work. They're going to be evicted eventually. So, yeah.
So we have questions coming up. The first one is that, is it possible in the current scenario to counter the state case? Are there such cases that we could draw inspirations from?
So I don't know of too many cases where one can draw inspirations from. Mainly because, there internationally, you could probably look at several places, Curitiba in Brazil. In South America, there may be cases because, but I can't at this point say. The United States had this tradition of community planning, and they even have a law which says that there has to be a neighborhood level participation when land use law is changed. But I've actually seen how that works. When the local municipalities earn money from taxes, the more tax money they can get, the more they have to spend, the more they have to create, all the stuff. The whole idea of public value is in the way in which you can gain profit or revenues from activity. And if it doesn't do that, then it's a cost or a tax. So even in the US, even though they have these liberal sort of things on paper, at this point of time, you can see cities like Flint, Michigan in the US that at one point were in bad shape because of the loss of the automobile industry. And now you have, there's no potable water there. There's a horrendous sort of a situation. There's white flight from most American cities in the 60s and 70s, civil rights. It's very hard to actually say that there is this, so this is why I think it's instructive to read James Scott. The state isn't interested in collaboration. Some democratic government decides to be more or less participatory, that's fine. But the state isn't interested. The state's purposes are to create order and control. And order and control are exercised by those who are part of the deep state, those who have access to, who have power over state resources. Much of this liberal theory, I feel right now, has really been a gloss over very hard state power that isn't interested in collaboration. There's a book by Mustafa Dicek, if you see this, called Urban Rage. And he points out from looking at examples all of Western Europe and in the United States of massive amounts of urban violence in the last 10 to 15 years. These were years, yes, they overlapped with the financial recession and the collapse of the financial industry in the US and in other places. But at the same time, highest rising levels of inequality. If the state, it's clearly that the state has been committed to economic inequality, economic distortion. So it's not really interested in collaboration of the kind that we are talking about, really. And I don't find any great examples of this. There can be a case made for better service delivery, state control in providing services, all of those sorts of things in ways of better, but not one where state cedes control to the extent where there is practical culmination of these collaborative processes.
So the next question is that, then how do you look at public policy in addressing inclusivity and participation? How can it cater to many inequalities created by projects such as Riverfront?
So public policy doesn't stand outside state power. It's a fiction that you can sort of, have something called public policy that stands outside the politics of state making. You can have more liberal schemes. You can have a lot more welfare schemes But that means that you have a state that is committed to welfare, so social welfare, and not to capitalist welfare. That's not been the case. A state that's committed to capitalist welfare and not social welfare, not in sort of the nationalization of healthcare, not in the universalization of education, none of these things, if they're not interested in that, then public policy is, I mean, public policy is basically state policy. There's no scope, there's no external intervention into state policy from anywhere except the state interests. So it's not possible. Public policy is also an instrument of control of elite, and reinforcement of elite domination. Otherwise, things would be different, wouldn't they? In 35, 40 years, 50 years, do you not think that things would be different if public policy actually worked for welfare, for transforming allocation of resources in society? So, yeah, it can't. Public policy can't address these unless the sort of political power of the state is transformative in that extent. So there's a question here about when NID was collaborating with the traders, they said, yes, of course, they communicated with the HCP team. We were always in touch with the HCP team, and the HCP team wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with collaboration, with participation, with talking to the traders. The architect called them a bunch of crooks who don't pay taxes because, the Sabarmati project was a real estate project, was a transportation and real estate project, it was not a social welfare project. It hasn't even stopped floods. One of the main things about flood control, I mean, Ahmedabad is much worse in terms of flooding every year than it was. Previous flood was in 1973. It was a big flood. So I'm not really sure why, that was the stance of the HCP towards any kind of collaboration or participation.
So, sir, since you commented on, the state's kind of intention for collaboration, there is a comment here that talks about how Town Vending Rules 2018, which was a successor of 2014 Town Vending Act, advocates for Town Vending Committee. And yes, it's a progressive step to include the vendors in decision making. However, experience reveals that there is a gap between anticipated and as is. Would you like to share your insight on this?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
So, so the Town Vending Rules to 2018, it advocates for Town Vending Committee. So there have been policy that are working on street vending acts and towards that, and it's written that yes, it's a progressive step to include vendors in decision making. However, the experience reveals that there's a gap between what is anticipated and as is. How the policies are actually written and how what it becomes eventually. So would you like to share your insight on this?
So, the genesis of the Street Vending Act is very sensitive, but in implementation, one is that it offered no protection to vendors. If there is a, the way in which the street works and the way in which people have to pay bribes to function is not really covered in the act, the Street Vending Act. So there's a reality of how things function on the street, of how street level bureaucrats, street level power works, with the full cognizance, of the government, of higher levels of government, right? I mean, the government cannot control and does not want to control, because what it wants is their control on the street. So as long as people are being controlled and being cleared every time that the chief minister passes by, all the vendors are cleared. So they lose. They're like ants in some way in conceptualization. So their participation or non-participation is immaterial with respect to the Street Vending Act. Does it protect vendors? I'm not so sure. Does it provide some semblance for some vendors to operate in certain places to be marked out? It does that, but that's what I'm talking about. It's providing a way for the state to make legible where vendors shall deem to be encroachers. If they're outside these zones, they're encroachers. And the fact is that you can't control the number of people who have fragile livelihoods that they need to street vend, right? Nobody does this out of sort of, it's not the first thing people dream of, that I'm going to be a street vendor. So I'm not so sure about the Street Vending Act. It has sensitive genesis, but on the ground, I have, in conversations with a lot of people, they still end up paying bribes and they still end up getting cleared any time that somebody passes by. I mean, it's a kind of a lip service as well in sorts. They have no stake in consultation. They really aren't involved in any of this stuff.
Right. So there is another question, along similar lines, that do you think that the involvement or collaborations of too many government organizational bodies in such transformation projects is the reason why many projects remain unsuccessful or remain low quality in our country? What is your say on this issue?
What kind of projects?
The Riverfront project. So I think it's trying to hint to the organization of how things flow. Kind of relates to your previous answer where you were talking about corruption. You're talking about multiple people involved and how would you control that. So I think the question is along those lines. That what is your say on the issue of different collaborations and too many government organizations involved?
I mean, as far as the Riverfront project goes, whether it's successful or unsuccessful, to me, that's kind of immaterial. The fact that by design, it's an exclusionary project that pushes an elite aesthetic on the city, right? That aesthetic doesn't really speak to much of the city as it has sort of in the lived experience of people. It's like this big thing, you can build the Eiffel Tower, you can build all these big things, but whether it's successful or not, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. How would you judge the success of this thing? So whether government, many agencies are involved. In fact, the Riverfront got a special purpose agency. It's quasi-government, very heavy involvement of the private sector, and therefore it's elite and exclusionary. If there was involvement of local government and not just the AMC's sort of top brass, but councillors, and also things were debated in the, if this was a participatory project of some kind, or that not this project. See, this is an architectural project, an urban architectural project. It's not really a city transformation in terms of social transformation project. So I couldn't care less whether it's successful or not from a point of, making money or not. Doesn't matter really. It's a loss for the exchequer for sure. The loss for public resources could have been much better used.
So the next question kind of, deals with the structure, and it's I think a larger question where Isha is asking that what do you feel is the major distinction between the authority structure that allows cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam to execute urban projects that bring about positive changes, which has not yet been possible in the Indian context? That's a very interesting question. See, if cities are compared just as sort of physical spaces and not seen as spaces where there is a sense of social, cultural life, it'll be very hard to actually talk about these physical transformations. Places like Copenhagen and Amsterdam have a long history of struggle, have a long history also of democratic citizenship, of active citizenship, and a very consensus-based governance system, right? And there's a high amount of equality to the folks, right? Here we are so rife in inequality on caste, on class, on religious terms. Almost every identity is marginalized in decision making, except this urban upper caste Hindu type of identity. So here's the thing: if we don't have social and cultural equality of sorts, right, citizenship loses its meaning. Poor citizenship will create these differences, and that's what we have. We have a very poor sense of the actualization of equality in India in general, and in Ahmedabad, in particular as well, in comparison to Copenhagen and Amsterdam. So if the urban authority is open to including the vendors in planning and design of a public space, what are the stages you think the participation can most successfully happen in India. Are there any processes to refer to?
Yeah, so there's an article by Sherry Arnstein on the ladder of participation. What Arnstein does is to look at processes through which citizens are involved and through which control is exercised by an authority that doesn't want any change. Status quo remains. And from the manipulation of the citizenry to one to a stage where the citizenry has full control over their own budgets, right? Because these budgets are public budgets; they belong to the public and not to government officials per se. Government officials are appointed by democratic reps. If you look at it institutionally, we have a complete corruption of the way in which we think about citizen involvement. The thinking about citizen involvement is citizens are basically, people with no expertise, with no thinking, with no sort of ideas. So, which also points to the fact that civic processes have been extremely exclusionary. The cities that were talked about earlier, where over a long period of time, the citizenry itself, people themselves are actively engaged constantly in improving their neighborhoods. They are empowered through resource allocation to exercise their designs, to experiment, to do all sorts of things. And until that kind of trust happens, and that kind of sort of equality is provided, that kind of egalitarian environment is in our kind of governance system, there's no real point talking about stakeholder involvement, because otherwise we're basically saying that, let's pick and choose when we want involvement, when we don't. I mean, this is kind of manipulative. This is not really honest sort of stakeholder participation. This is like, it's like a lip service to hearing somebody else out and throwing it out. You come with your own agenda. You come with resources and power. You know what you have to do. You have to get people on board. That's the standard view of citizen participation here in these projects. Until that changes. So what I'm saying is that changes have to be in terms of the political ideas of equality and citizenship, right? Urban planning and urban design are handmaidens to political power. And unless that changes, no amount of instrumental tweaks is going to sort of create a nicer project in this kind of environment.
Thank you, sir. Another question, this is a bit different from our, I think this could be our last question for the day because it's already 11:30. This is related to, the current situation, COVID-19. Meet is asking that I would like to know from you, how do you think the pandemic situation has or will impact the functioning of self-organized markets like Sunday Market? How will social distancing norms and dehumanizing way of looking at these marginalized groups, especially by people in power like AMC, vendors, super spreaders, will influence governance of these marketplaces?
It's a kind of a big comment there, and interesting comment about the stigmatization of vulnerable populations. It's very interesting that people who simply have to be out there are being labeled as super spreaders. I mean, nothing could be more dehumanizing than calling vegetable vendors, without which people like us sitting comfortably social distancing in our homes wouldn't be able to get any food to eat. It's just remarkable the kind of derision that the state has on the most vulnerable and yet the most crucial parts of the population. Sanitation workers, health workers uh, are facing tremendous amounts of distress, but they're forced, unlike the rest of us, they're being forced to go to work and they have to go out to work. Are they provided safety equipment? For the first month, they were not. They were provided almost nothing. They had to purchase all these things and take care of themselves. They were not given any wages, increase in any wages. Many people got no wages at all. Their wages were withheld and they were forced to come to work. So this tells you what kind of a view the state has on questions like this. As far as the market goes, any crowded place in a pandemic where infection spreads is of course dangerous for people. But if And in many places, I think I read something about the Spanish flu as well. And in many markets had to be either shut down or over time, people had to operate in a different sort of way. Basically, without an economic provision that supports the vulnerable population, this is not going to stop. And it's not a matter of stigmatizing people who continue to work, continue to sort of fight for their livelihoods in times like this, because they have no other option. It's not a matter of leisure that people are going and starting a stall. I get my salary sitting at home. People don't have the next day's worth of food. So my sense is that it's a huge, colossal failure of the state, right? To not provide budgets allocated in certain ways that provides a cushion to the most sort of vulnerable in the society. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this is very well fitted in the kind of discussions we're having in our studios right now. We are questioning the entire narrative of the visions that cities have, and who has those visions and why those visions, and what has been the history and how has that history impacted our today. And I think it kind of very well fits in because we're all kind of tuned into that narrative currently. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, sir. I'm sure on the behalf of my batch, I can say that on the behalf of my friends, I can say that they must have been super thrilled after today's discussion. Mehnaz, would you like to add something?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Navdeep. Thank you everyone for being here.